Japan, once celebrated as a global powerhouse, its population reached its peak at 128 million in 2008. Fast forward to 2024, and that number has dropped to 123.5 million, and it's not slowing down. Experts predict that by 2100, Japan's population could plummet to just 63 million. This isn't a gradual decline, it's a demographic freefall. While the overall population shrinks, another alarming trend is emerging: the rapid aging of Japan's society. United Nations data reveals that nearly 30% of Japan's population is aged 65 or older, a figure that far surpasses that of other developed nations. Projections suggest the senior population ratio could climb to an astounding 41% by the end of the century. Experts imagine a country where almost half of the population is elderly. The implications are staggering. How can an economy thrive when the younger workforce is vanishing? Even a rise in Japan's foreign population over the last decade hasn't been enough to bridge the gap. Foreign nationality accounts for 3.4 million residents in 2023, and this is still less than 3% of the total population. Meanwhile, Japan's population falls by more than 800,000 people, with the drop in every prefecture for the first time in 2022. The population decline is comparable to the entire city of San Francisco disappearing in just 1 year. The impact on the economy is severe. Labor shortages are crippling industries, businesses are shutting down, and critical sectors like healthcare and education are struggling to keep up. Just in 2023, 260 companies went bankrupt because they couldn't find enough workers, according to a report by Teikoku Databank. Yet, despite these challenges, Japan's unemployment rate remains below 3%, one of the lowest among developed nations. This paradox highlights a stark reality. It's not about job opportunities, it's about the lack of people to fill them. In 2023, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida issued a grim warning. The nation is on the brink of being unable to function as a society. So how did one of the most advanced countries in the world end up here? What does this mean for its economy and future? What is the Japanese government doing about this crisis? To understand the depth of Japan's population crisis, consider Kawakami Village. 7 years ago, a baby named Kentaro Yokobori was born there, the first in over 25 years. His arrival was celebrated like a miracle, with elderly villagers flocking to meet him. But while Kentaro symbolizes hope, the numbers tell a darker story. 40 years ago, 6,000 people lived in Kawakami. Today, that number has dwindled to just 1,150, most of them senior citizens.
Did you guys know before moving out here that the average age was as old as it is? No. You didn't know?
40年前ね。
40 years ago, the population was around 6,000. Today, it's 1,156.
Abandoned homes are common, and some have even been reclaimed by nature. Kawakami is just one of many rural communities across Japan facing extinction. While cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto continue to grow, thanks in part to their efficient transportation networks, rural areas are being hollowed out. Over 90% of Japan's population now lives in urban centers, leaving industries like farming and forestry desperate for workers. For the first time since records began in 1899, fewer than 800,000 babies were born in Japan in 2022, a milestone that arrived 8 years earlier than predicted by experts. At the heart of Japan's demographic decline lies its falling birth rate. In 2022, the fertility rate hit a historic low of 1.26 births per woman. By 2023, it had slipped further to 1.2, well below the 2.1 needed to maintain a stable population. This isn't just a post-pandemic anomaly. While lockdowns and restrictions delayed weddings and disrupted family plans, the trend reflects deeper societal challenges. Japan's aging population adds another layer to the crisis. In 2000, 17% of the population was over 65. By 2022, that proportion had nearly doubled to almost 30%, totaling around 36 million people, a level that persists in 2024. The nation's aging population meant more deaths, and when deaths outpace births, the population decline accelerates even further. Despite the demographic challenges, many elderly Japanese continue to contribute to the workforce. In 2023, over 9 million seniors remained employed, accounting for roughly 1 in 7 workers. While their participation highlights resilience, it's far from enough to counterbalance the shrinking pool of younger workers. Japan's workforce, which currently stands at 74 million, its lowest level since 1975, is projected to plummet further reaching just 49 million by 2050, according to Morgan Stanley. Compounding the issue, a survey by Teikoku Databank revealed that over 50% of Japanese companies across sectors are grappling with a full-time employee shortage, underscoring the strain on industries and public services. The decline in the working-age population presents an economic conundrum. Fewer workers mean reduced productivity, lower tax revenues, and greater difficulty funding the ballooning costs of Social Security. By 2040, Japan's Social Security expenditures are expected to soar to 190 trillion yen, a 1.6-fold increase from 2018, driven by rising pensions, healthcare, and welfare demands for the elderly. With fewer workers contributing to the tax base, this financial burden will fall disproportionately on a shrinking younger workforce, further destabilizing the economy. Japan's economic growth is already feeling the strain. In 2020, the International Monetary Fund projected that Japan's declining population could drag GDP growth down by 0.8% annually over the next 40 years. With fewer workers and diminished productivity, this outcome seems unavoidable. While Japan has managed modest economic gains in recent years, its growth remains far from robust, at an average of 1 to 2%. Without decisive action, the nation risks slipping into a prolonged economic contraction, mirroring the downward spiral of its population trends. This shift would disproportionately affect rural regions, where depopulation and the migration of younger generations to urban centers are already accelerating the collapse of local economies. A tangible example of the demographic shift can be seen in the small village of 10A. Two students, Aoi Hoshi and Eita Sato, will soon graduate as the last remaining students of Yumoto Junior High School.
姉ちゃんもこの学校で自分この学校で、弟もこの学校に通ってなんかしたりとかするんだろうなと思ってたんですけど、なんかそれができないっていうか、そういうので同じ学校になんか通えないんだっていうのがすごいショックが大きかったです。
Once they leave, the school will permanently close its doors. No new students are coming in. This story is far from unique. Declining birth rates have led to widespread school closures, particularly in rural areas. Between 2002 and 2020, nearly 9,000 schools across Japan have closed permanently, with around 450 schools shuttering annually. These closures reflect the broader implications of a declining population on local communities and their infrastructure. Japan's population crisis isn't a sudden calamity, but the culmination of demographic shifts over decades. Central to this is the third baby boom that never materialized, a pivotal moment that sealed the nation's demographic fate. To understand, we need to revisit the two earlier baby booms. The first, in the late 1940s, saw soldiers returning from World War II and starting families, spurring a post-war population surge. The second came in the 1970s, when the children of the first boom began their own families, creating another spike in birth rates. Naturally, a third boom seemed inevitable as this second generation matured in the 2000s, yet it never came. The absence of this expected baby boom left Japan's population not just stagnating, but entering a steep decline. But why didn't the third baby boom happen?
なので、個人として考えると、国としてやばい状況だったとしても、自分の幸せを優先するということですね。
A pivotal shift in Japan's marital customs began in the 1960s. Before then, arranged marriages were the societal norm, and remaining unmarried past a certain age was almost unthinkable. However, by 1965, a shift occurred. Love marriages outnumbered arranged ones. While this change may seem like a romantic evolution, it also ushered in a cultural shift where marriage became less obligatory. Consequently, marriage rates began declining in the 1970s and are now at historic lows. Fewer marriages naturally led to fewer children, exacerbating the population crisis. Economic stagnation further exacerbates this trend. Japan's economy has endured decades of sluggish growth, with real wages stagnating since the 1990s. While the OECD's average annual salary stands at approximately $50,000, Japan lags behind at just $39,000. Raising children in Japan is no small expense either. It's ranked as the third most costly country globally for child rearing, behind only China and South Korea. Japan's demanding work culture introduces yet another challenge. Grueling work hours, often exceeding 10 hours a day, leave little room for family life, exacerbating the nation's demographic issues. In 2022, overwork-related suicides, or karoshi, rose to 2,968 from 1,935 in 2021, according to the Health Ministry. The same report found that 10% of men and 4% of women work more than 60 hours a week. While Japan is pushing a 4-day working week to start in April 2025, but its workaholic culture makes it a hard sell. The challenges don't end there. Japan's outdated family registration system also plays a significant role in suppressing birth rates. Unlike many countries where a substantial proportion of births occur outside of marriage, up to 70% in some nations, Japan's figure is a mere 2.4%. This is partly due to legal and cultural norms that stigmatize children born out of wedlock. Unmarried fathers are not required to acknowledge or support their children financially, creating a structural barrier for unmarried couples considering parenthood. This creates a societal bottleneck. If you can't afford to marry, you likely won't have children. And if you don't marry, having children outside of marriage remains stigmatized. This cycle further contributes to Japan's demographic woes. In response, Japan has implemented several policies aimed at addressing the crisis. One significant area of focus has been immigration. In 2022, long-term immigration rose by 144,000, up 150% from 2021, with 55% being workers and 41% their families. Reforms by the Immigration Services Agency have eased restrictions for foreign graduates to stay in Japan, provided they find relevant employment. However, Japan's restrictive approach to immigration remains a significant barrier. The country's policies emphasize temporary residency, making permanent settlement challenging. Dual citizenship is outright prohibited, requiring foreign citizens to renounce their original nationality. This not only discourages foreign talent, but also complicates the return of Japanese nationals who have lived abroad. On the domestic front, the government has introduced financial incentives to encourage larger families and support rural revitalization, essentially paying its citizens to have more kids and to relocate to rural areas away from cities such as Tokyo. The Children's Future Strategy policy, launched under Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, allocates 3.5 trillion yen, which is approximately $23.7 billion, annually for 3 to 5 years, with plans to double child care spending by 2030 to enhance child-rearing support. Families now receive expanded child allowances with no income restrictions, as well as childbirth grants of up to 500,000 yen, which is approximately $3,300. Beyond financial incentives, the government is also encouraging families to relocate to rural areas. These efforts aim to revitalize communities that have been hit hardest by depopulation, turning abandoned schools and vacant neighborhoods into thriving spaces once again. Another notable initiative has been leveraging Japan's aging population as a potential asset rather than a liability. Japan's revised law encourages companies to retain employees until the age of 70, alongside subsidies for businesses that hire older workers. This has contributed to record-high employment levels among citizens aged 65 and older in Japan, right behind South Korea. In 2023, over 9 million individuals in this age group were employed. This shift seeks to turn an aging population into a valuable asset rather than a liability. The question persists, are these policies enough to address Japan's population crisis? Before you go, here's a fun fact. 90,000 Japanese were over 100 years old in 2023. That's the second highest number in the world, right behind the United States with 98,000.